Hello, and welcome to Tales of the Sea. I'm your host, Mark Winkworth. Today we're going to be talking about what I consider to be one of the most mysterious and fascinating subjects when it comes to the sea, shipwrecks. What is it about a shipwreck that gets into our blood? Is it the mystery, the tragedy, the loss of life, the grief of those who lost loved ones? Or is it the feeling that somewhere beneath those waves, history is still waiting to be discovered? My guest today has made it his life's work to find out. James Delgado is a maritime archaeologist, National Geographic explorer, and host of the television series The Sea Hunters, as well as the author of 33 books, including The Great Museum of the Sea, A Human History of Shipwrecks. James has dived on the Titanic, the USS Arizona, and many, many other lost ships in his long and distinguished career. I'm pleased to welcome to Tales of the Sea, James Delgado. James, you describe the sea as the largest museum on Earth. And when I thought about that, it seemed to imply a whole lot more than simply the term shipwreck might imply. Were you thinking about that when you sat down to write the book?
Yeah, and I need to explain that I don't think I'm the first, nor will I be the last to actually refer to the ocean as a great museum. But in that, there's so much that's down there. In addition to shipwrecks, there's all that life that I talk about. But there's also other sites. Consider that with the last ice age, when it ended and the sea levels rose, much of the coastline where people had lived for tens of thousands of years was drowned. And the settlements that they had are now underwater. It's part of that museum. And we see this every now and then with the discovery of something being trawled up off of a seabed, whether it's shallower in Doggerland off of northern Europe, or in the Mediterranean where divers in the caves off the coast of France discover Cosquer, an amazing bottleneck that sealed off a still dry portion of a cave with cave paintings and still wet mud with footprints and handprints and extinguished torches from 30,000 years ago, basically. So you've got all of that, but you also have these ships that speak so much to so many things that I think people not only find fascinating, but also have a whole range of emotions about.
Jim, in your career, you've investigated more than 200 sites at this point. Does that thrill when you first come across a wreck coming through the murky water? Does that ever get old?
No, I may be looking at something old, but I don't feel old about it because every discovery, it's like being introduced to a new book. It's a story that I can learn more about in some cases.
So we're going to talk about some of those amazing wrecks throughout your career, but I want to jump back. I'd love listeners to understand a little bit about your background, where you grew up, went to school, biggest influences on your life, and when you were first kind of really hooked into this notion that there was something in the sea that you could ultimately spend your life exploring.
Well, the sea came somewhat later, though I was no stranger to the water. Both my grandfathers had boats. Both of these guys were lake sailors, because my mother grew up in Oregon, and so we'd go out and fish off the coast there for salmon. But it was archaeology itself that got me hooked at first. And that started in 5th and 6th grade with the thought of Egypt, and then Maya and Aztec and Toltec, and Olmec, everything possible in Central America, to Greece and Rome. That transitioned into a love of prehistoric archaeology because I grew up in San Jose. Silicon Valley was not yet a thing. It was orchards and hay farms and ranches. And so I got into the history and the archaeology of that. And then in 1978, I show up at the National Park Service to start my federal career there. And they happened to have hit a ship buried downtown at the corner of Clay and Sansom next to the Transamerica Pyramid that was now 20 feet beneath the street because the old waterfront of 1849 had been filled in to create modern San Francisco and buried a fleet of ships that had come in 1849, 1850.
Talk about a discovery. Wow.
The mud had sealed things so perfectly that with that one ship in 1978, the Niantic, we were getting rolls of carpet, well-preserved boots and shoes. A guy taking off his leather jacket and stacked it on a crate next to another crate full of bottles of champagne with the liquid still in them. And, I mean, pencils that survived that still said Faber, London. So that hooked me. And from there, I was introduced to diving by the Park Service. And I haven't looked at my wake since.
That's a great way to put it. That's fascinating and amazing. I was going to ask what your first shipwreck memory was. It turns out the first shipwreck is actually on land.
Yeah.
Buried there in the mud.
Well, and I've kept that aspect of it up. I've dug up other ships, most recently just a couple of years ago in St. Augustine, Florida, that was buried, that was hit when they were putting in a storm sewer line. To wrecks that washed out on beaches from the 19th century, I mean, from everywhere from Maine all the way down into the Carolinas to the California coast and beyond. I haven't met a shipwreck that hasn't fascinated me. And you don't always have to dive.
They could be right under your feet when you're walking down the sidewalk. James, what was the first time that you actually dove down to a wreck?
It was on the Northern California coast, and it was a steamer that had wrecked in 1908. And coming up onto it, I mean, the hull had been battered down by the ocean's waves over the century or more. Suddenly there it is. And what fascinated me, it was a puzzle in a way with the pieces scattered, but you couldn't get a full view of it. So part of the excitement was tracing it along and saying, okay, here's the propeller shaft. The propeller's gone. There's a boiler. Here's a section of the hull. There's an intact porthole. And be able to then in your mind's eye try to put it all back together, particularly in those days when we didn't have the same type of gear that we have now for mapping. With such accuracy, an awful lot of that early on was a slate with a piece of mylar on it and a pencil that floated that you'd grab at the end of a piece of rubber tubing to keep it from going away, and you'd make your notes or sketch.
James, the mystery of a wreck in so many ways is so fascinating.
Perhaps it's not mystery, but it is the fact that here's something that's on the bottom that physically connects you to a marine tragedy or to an event that seemingly passed out of sight of the world because it sank. And most people don't think of going into the water to see these things. And because some of them, when they sink deeper, basically become a ghost town, I think that that's what fascinates people. But then mysteries as they arise. What happened here? What happened there? What exactly sank it? Even if it's in the midst of a battle and a ship blows up, what exactly went on? Or in the case of Titanic, where exactly did the iceberg hit? What type of damage did it do? So there's all of those questions. And then for some of us, the other aspect, which I find the most fascinating as an archaeologist, is when we encounter evidence of people that built something, people that shaped something, people that put their luggage or a cargo on board, and what that says about those people. And yes, from time to time, evidence of those people themselves.
James, let me ask, of all the wrecks that you've explored, over 200 at this point, are there any that really changed your understanding of history in a way that maybe surprised you?
But for me, perhaps the most profound thing was the realization that really gave me an opportunity, for lack of a better word, to not only touch the past, but in a way, in some of these wrecks, to be able to almost journey through time because they were so well preserved. I mean, Titanic clearly has disintegrated and is growing all sorts of rusticles because of its colonization by the bacteria. And yet, being one of the few that's been able not only to just go to Titanic, but to go inside Titanic with the sub, when we went into the engine room, yes, it's badly damaged and twisted, and portions are open, and you can see the ocean on the outside, but we're cruising through this area, very tight space. You just had this sense of those engineers staying there to the end. A story I've said before, some people probably remember this, is looking over and seeing a teapot still hanging.
Wow.
A little tin teapot on a wire hanging on the railing, and looking at it and thinking, because it was a very human touch in this otherwise industrial space, a place where people had been working in incredible heat, and where some stayed to the very end and lost their lives to try to keep the steam up to the point where the lights wouldn't go out and that they could still broadcast the SOS. And I looked at that teapot and I thought back to a scene from the 1958 movie A Night to Remember, where chief engineer comes back and gives the boys the news, and one guy says, "Well, Chief, I guess not much hope for us." And he looks at me and goes, "Anyone fancy a cup of tea?" And I thought, at the time, how British, how brave. And then there was that pot. For a moment, whether that actually happened or not, it was as if time had blurred. It's as if a curtain has been lifted and you could almost see into the past.
Wow. It's amazing. And to realize that so few people on the planet will ever experience such a thing. I mean, it's like outer space, or more like inner space, actually.
Well, we call it inner space for a reason. And there's more of those, there's more astronauts than there are those of us who are aquanauts.
James, there are so many ships that you've explored that I would love to talk about, spend more time with, but some of them really stand out. One is certainly the Clotilda. Fascinating story. And I don't think a lot of people know that it was the last known slave ship.
Just for some background, the beginnings of the North Atlantic slave trade in 1619, thousands of ships brought millions of people to America. Ultimately, that trade is deemed illegal by the United States and other nations, but it doesn't stop slavery itself, but the slave trade and shipping people over from Africa. That leads in the United States to the interior or the internal slave trade, where people are sold down the river, literally. About a mile and a half from me is the home of one enslaved family, some of whom were sold after the ban on the slave trade in 1808 and sent on down south. And it's today an historic site here in Rockville, Maryland. Clotilda voyage was basically set up as a bet that these guys could defy federal authorities, get past the blockade of British and American and other ships, and bring a cargo of people in. And so in 1860, this voyage is undertaken, sails from Mobile to Dahomey, today Benin, picks up 110 people at least. There were obviously a few more. Some of them died on the voyage, and there are some suggestions, it's actually one survivor stated later, that very small children, once they got out to sea, were thrown overboard and drowned.
Oh, dear.
They were loaded initially because their mothers or their older siblings were with them. But once there was no hope, then Captain Foster tossed them over. It sails and it arrives in Mobile under cover of darkness. And these people are offloaded onto a river steamer, taken up, and then dispersed and sold. And a group of them ended up settling in and around the sawmill and the shipyard of their enslaver, Captain Timothy Mayer, and others who had also invested in the voyage. Their story is a powerful one because many of them remained in that area. Some of these people, they married other survivors, other Clotilda captives, as they referred to themselves as, or they married into the African-American community that was there. And their descendants are still there today. And the community that they built, known as Africa Town, is an important historical site and part of larger Mobile. Many of those folks knew exactly where the ship was. At the termination of the voyage, once they were taken off, Captain William Foster just took it up the river a little ways, broke open the seacock to flood it and set it on fire. Not to completely destroy it, but to burn out the evidence in the slave hold. As you can imagine, a long voyage with people naked and chained and just a bucket to use and being seasick. So he wanted to destroy as much of the evidence as he could. And as he said, I burned and sank it in 20 feet of water. People knew about it, knew more or less where it was. And in fact, it's a charted wreck on the river. It just doesn't say Clotilda. There's a photograph of it at low water that shows up in that one local historian, Emma Roach, included in a book about all of this. But as to which one it actually was remained a mystery. A crusading environmental reporter named Ben Raines decided he'd go look for it and thought he had it. It turned out not to be, and that was the stage in which I was asked by National Geographic and others to come down and offer to help to see if we could locate it. The question really was one of just a systematic survey. And with that, we conducted a systematic survey. Mr. Raines came back with the University of Mississippi and did a survey as well. And everybody converged on one target, which was target number 5 in our survey. We had to systematically CSI this, and that was the biggest part of it. It just took time because there were people that still wanted to say, nope, this didn't happen, or there was no such ship as the Clotilda, or that's not it. So we had to systematically move through a whole series of steps to be able to conclusively say, yeah, this is Clotilda. The wreck is largely intact. The back end is torn off, but the hull remains upright, tilted a bit. The bow, with a portion of the deck missing, but just still built practically up to that deck line, is there. The forecastle, where the sailors were housed, that's filled with silt. But in the center, where this centerboard schooner had been fitted out in its cargo hold to hold the captives, a fair amount of that's intact. The platforms themselves have collapsed, the upright posts that held them, basically stacking them in layers. That was one of the pieces of evidence that we ultimately used, as well as a whole range of other things. Being able to conclusively identify it, of course, was a very emotional and powerful moment for the descendant community, but for Mobilians and for a number of other folks. And what's happened since then is more work on the wreck, plans to keep it in the river and to stabilize it, looking towards creating a memorial to it, but also it's been part of an effort to revitalize Africa Town, which is surrounded by industrial development with a highway running right through the heart of it, coming off of a major trans-river bridge. And so an effort to try to boost this historic Black community that is Africa Town and tell this story, because of all those various ships, starting with likely the first arrival of a slave ship in what's now the United States in 1619, we don't know where all of them are or went, but here's the last known one, and we know exactly where it is.
It's an extraordinary story. Jim, what can these shipwrecks teach us that written records often can't? In your book, you mention that as a kid, looking at pictures of the pyramids, there was a ship found right next to the Great Pyramid, buried in the sand.
Yeah, Pharaoh's solar bark for his soul to go into the afterlife. Really an amazing craft, the solar bark of Pharaoh Khufu, or Cheops, that told us a great deal about ancient Egyptian shipbuilding or boat building. But there, even if you don't have much of a wreck that survives, one of the earliest underwater maritime archaeological excavations was at a site off the coast of Turkey called Uluburun. And what it showed was 3,000 years ago, there was essentially a global trade by water that saw amber from the Baltic and goods from the Levant and from subtropical Africa throughout the rest of the Mediterranean, all tied together into a complex world trade system that reminds us that those people from way past then, they were smarter than we'd like to give them credit for, and they did a lot.
Absolutely.
In some cases, just the survival of a wreck itself provides a physical link to that past and reintroduces new audiences generation after generation to these stories. And I certainly saw that with the work we did at Pearl Harbor, especially diving on and in USS Arizona.
At the memorial there in Hawaii.
My grandfather was a veteran, and I knew a number of men and their wives who had been there at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, and guys that had been on Arizona, including some hideously wounded. Again, just diving on Arizona, being able to share what we could bring back in terms of the mapping, the filming, the models that were built of the wreck, and just the fact that the wreck itself, straddled by that monument, with the portion sticking out of the water, provides a place for people to come and connect with that past and to honor that service and that sacrifice. Again, that's part of the reason why I and my colleagues, we do what we do.
I had in mind to ask if you thought there was one single shipwreck that was perhaps the most important in terms of human history. But now I'm thinking, Jim, how could there be just one? I mean, there's so many that have taught us so much for thousands of years, right?
Absolutely. It's like walking into a library and saying, pick out the most important book. It's like, no, I'd really like to read them all.
Of Of course. You know, I'm going to jump back to the Titanic just for a minute. The discovery, I believe it was 1985, Robert Ballard. I want to say it raised public awareness and interest in underwater archaeology. It feels like that was a real turning point.
I think it was a turning point in a variety of ways, because while we'd all looked at wrecks in shallower water, and finding them even in 100 feet or less sometimes was a very difficult thing, what Bob did with the team was show that anything was possible with time, technology, and frankly, some money to be able to do it.
Right.
That was a game changer. And since then, we've, of course, gone back out. We've seen other wrecks and deeper wrecks than Titanic. And once more, I mean, every time we do that, and that's the bulk of what I do now, I just keep coming back to that moment when Bob and the team did that back in 85. And here we are 41 years later, going deeper and seeing more. And to be able to go with Bob's team to Midway in 2023 and to, with his team and crew, to look at some of the wrecks, and then to go back with NOAA,
the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration,
and be the shore lead for the dives on and into USS Yorktown at 15,000 feet. I think what made that all happen in a way was, of course, that discovery of Titanic, which grabbed the world's attention, and nobody's let go yet.
No, they certainly have not. You know, interesting. I was just a couple of months ago, my wife and I were in Belfast, and we got to go to the Titanic Museum, which it's just extraordinary.
Well, and it's right there where they built her. You can stay in the hotel that was the offices and where the drafting rooms were. And when I first went there for meetings on Titanic and Carpathia, the ship that, of course, had rescued the survivors, because I was the archaeologist for the Carpathia mission when we found her and identified her.
Right. Standing in that yard outside the museum, there's just this feeling that comes over you.
Just that sense of history and that connection to communities. And that's the other piece of this. Ships may go out and sail and they get lost on the ocean, but they are tied back to places, not just to countries or to states or to cities, but to neighborhoods, to communities, to people and to families. And that is a pretty profound aspect of why we care, I think.
Absolutely. That human aspect, I think, ultimately creates the connection that we have to these sites. We talked a little bit about ancient civilizations, Bronze Age, Kublai Khan's fleet. It's fascinating what these shipwrecks over time have come to represent.
Absolutely. The other thing, though, is that oftentimes what we also see is that as an archaeologist, what I'm fascinated by is people, what people do, what they build, how they use the things they build, what they say about what they do. Ships are one aspect of it, and I think it's a fascinating one because it is one aspect of all civilizations that ties us together. But it's also, shipwrecks are these intensely focused moments where the best and the worst of you is borne out through circumstance. You know, having been in a couple, near disasters myself, you definitely, I see these places at times as the places of death. You can't, particularly with Titanic, for example, not pass over certain areas and have the sense, having read the accounts and suddenly being there with the davits still there for launching those boats, and not think about that.
Of course.
But even if you don't know that this is where the Strausses walked off together to die together because he couldn't get into the boat, or that this is a spot where one young man on that morning of December 7th walked out of his post as the metal glowed white hot and had the flesh melting from him as he plunged into the ocean to survive, to an unknown skeleton, broken, sitting on the bottom in the Kublai Khan fleet wrecks from 1281. And looking at that, and his helmet's to one side, his leather armor is splayed out in pieces, and a few bones, and his weapons, and his rice bowl. And to work with my Japanese colleagues who were able to identify him as a young Chinese guy, probably no more than 21, 22, raised in the Guangzhou area, and his name was Wang, and he was a commander of 100 troops. He was a centurion.
Wow.
And I remember drifting over that guy and thinking, did you ever think that 800 years later you'd be found? That somebody would drift over you and to be able to know who you were and to say your name again? Those are some of the things that when you are there and you are participating in these dives, it's humbling. It's both terrible and wonderful in a way. And that also comes through with the work we do where we're able to find a ship or a plane, and we're able to tell a family this is what happened, or to bring somebody home.
Yeah. There's that sense of closure at last.
Having been the guy that's had to call families and say, hey, we found them.
Oh, that is an aspect of your work I was totally unaware of. I can't help but think that with so much research continuing to go on, so many wrecks around the world, that the clock is ticking. Climate change, ocean acidification. Are we in danger, James, of losing some of these sites? Are we already losing some yet to be discovered clues or wrecks that, faster than you would like to see?
In some cases, yes. I think wrecks on beaches, wrecks in shallow areas, wrecks in the Arctic. We worked in the Falkland Islands where previously marine borers were not present, and you had these amazingly well-preserved wooden ships from the early to mid-19th century. They're falling apart and being eaten now because the warming oceans and the change in the salinity has introduced those borers to them. And the same thing's going to happen in the Baltic, and it's going to happen in the Arctic, and even probably in Antarctica. So, yes, we will be losing these, but we're also losing ships, particularly World War II warships that are shallower, within a few hundred feet, that are being systematically scrapped for their pre-atomic age steel. China is one of the big perpetrators of that. Entire warships, marine graves. But we still have no idea of what else remains down there in the deepest parts of it. Ultimately, I think as technology continues to improve, to get more accessible, it's getting cheaper to do these kinds of surveys and to get down there. And with the robotic vehicles now, the beauty of something like what we just did with Midway and other work we've done in the Gulf and beyond is the robots go down there. They're positioned from a ship. They can stay as long as they need to. They don't rely on batteries. They're powered from the surface. They stream back everything. And then from a satellite, I'm able to communicate directly with the ship and to the ROV pilot and to everybody else on the ship as that team works to position and bring that thing down there and document. But it's not just me alone. It's not me as a diver. I'm joined by colleagues from all over the world who represent not only historical or archaeological knowledge, but marine scientists. Because these are voyages into inner space that, in a Star Trek kind of way, not only seek out evidence of our own history, but new life. Because every time we go, we discover life forms that we didn't think possible or that we didn't know existed in the deep ocean. And that includes even, microscopic things when we bring water samples back. But the other part of it that's powerful is that we're also able to connect it directly to the public.
Which is very cool.
These dives, particularly if they're off a NOAA ship, are streamed live, no paywall, and people can ask questions, and sometimes those questions come in hot and fast, and you can't answer them all. But Bob Ballard's team, they have educators, and they will sort through the questions, and they'll say, hey, out of the 300 questions that just came in, 50 people have asked this one, and they feed it back to you, and then they say, so, Jim, what was that you guys just passed? Because 50 people asked that. So you can do that.
Very cool.
But what it also means is that they're seeing it as it happens, which makes them explorers along with us, seeing it for the first time as we see it. And when we did the Battle of Midway mission, what I heard back as we broadcast that around the world was ultimately we reached 1 billion people.
Wow.
Because it's Midway, and there's these huge aircraft carriers, the badly damaged Kaga and Akagi, and then USS Yorktown.
It's amazing. Having seen some of the footage, you never know what's going to impact people. Lots of moments where you're just like, wow, I can't believe what I'm seeing.
The damage to the Japanese carriers was one, particularly as they'd plowed into the seabed, and the evidence of the huge fires and the explosions that had torn them apart, to the scattered boots and shoes from the crew that went down with her. On Yorktown, how intact it was, how the scars from the bomb hits and the fires and the torpedo hits were still there. We dropped into the elevator shaft, into the hangar, and there's this huge mural of Yorktown's worldwide voyages.
Yeah, painted by the sailors, I remember.
We were able to find 2 aircraft that had landed towards the end of the battle, having come back from striking Japanese carriers, and they were from the Enterprise. But the one thing that got the most attention in terms of a lot of the feedback, a 1941 Ford Woody that was still parked inside the hangar.
Seeing that station wagon was amazing. So here you have this online audience, in this case, 1 billion people, and they're actually contributing and making the experience all that much more meaningful. Who would have thought years ago that this would ever be possible?
In the past, when I'm diving those first wrecks, it's just me with a mask or a full face mask or a helmet on and focused on it. And now I'm sharing that.
Okay, I want to do a very quick insert here as I can hear listeners out there asking, where can I experience these amazing expeditions? Well, NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and you also heard James mention Bob Ballard. The easiest way to go about finding these expeditions is to go to YouTube and simply do a search for Dive to the USS Yorktown, for example, and you'll see these videos come up. And if you want to know what's coming up on the horizon in terms of future expeditions, you can go directly to the NOAA website, or you could go to the Ocean Exploration Trust. That's where you'll find Bob Ballard's team. And you could check out the calendar and see when the next expedition is planned. You could actually participate live in that expedition, as James was explaining. It's pretty exciting stuff. Let's get back to the interview. James, I want to ask you about the relationship between archaeologists like yourself and treasure hunters. Would you describe that relationship as cooperative or more antagonistic?
I think it's been more antagonistic, particularly through the years. Archaeologists operate on a principle, if we're physicians, you do no harm. We're loath to cut into a patient unless we have to. And when we do it, it's for a very good reason. We're going to find evidence. The work we did on Clotilda was very limited and just sufficient to be able to say yes. In other cases, we'll excavate. Part of that is that we'll recover things, and it may not be something that looks valuable, and yet it rewrites history. It's a fragment of wood that turns out to be, in the case of the Ullabrunn shipwreck, a folding book that opened up with an interior filled with wax that they basically kept notes on. Oftentimes in the past, a collector would come along, dump everything out because they want that amphora to sell or to put on their mantelpiece, and they're not thinking about what we could learn. And there's extremists on both sides of this. I think what I was trying to say in the book is I understand why people love the idea of treasure and the flash of gold. It's exciting, yeah.
Sure. Have you ever seen gold on a wreck?
We've seen coins every now and then, and if we pick one up, it's really to figure out how old the wreck is.
Right.
Going back, there was an awful lot of stuff years ago where ships would just get torn apart in a search for gold. So, yes, antagonism is a good way to phrase it. And what I wouldn't want to see, as I have in a couple of cases, is that the push for treasure gets in the way of looking after something that can rewrite the history books or where something's a grave. I wouldn't want to see somebody tear apart an historic shipwreck that still has dead people in it, even if it's been a couple 100 years.
Yeah, agreed, certainly. I remember being at the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, Sweden, a number of years ago. It's an incredible museum, extraordinary, and a true feat of engineering. But there were sailors that died when that ship went down. They've kept some of those bodies preserved on the lower level of the museum. But to me, it really begs the question, where is the line between respect and honoring the dead and the need for further discovery?
And again, it comes back to what's the discussion. With the Swedes, I know there was a discussion. They thought a bit about it, and the decision was ultimately made to honor who they were by reconstructing and getting a sense of who they were, even if their names were not known, to be able to once again acknowledge their humanity. I'm not saying I would completely agree with that, but again, I'm not sure I would completely disagree. I mean, I wasn't there at the time when those decisions were made. Why I wrote the book was so that questions like this could be asked and help perhaps inform discussions the next time something comes along.
Right. Makes sense. They certainly are important discussions to have. Okay, Jim, I'm here on the coast of Maine, and I would be totally remiss if I didn't mention one of the shipwrecks that has captivated so many people for so many years. That's the wreck of the Royal Tar in October of 1836. A tragic and kind of surreal disaster, one of the most famous in the history of maritime Maine. The sidewheeler Royal Tar, traveling from St. John in New Brunswick to Portland, Maine, caught fire and sank off the coast of Vinyl Haven Island in Penobscot Bay. There were nearly 100 people on board. 30, I think it was more than 30 actually, lost their lives. But the cargo included a traveling circus. There were lions, a Bengal tiger, a huge elephant named Mogul. All of the animals, except for 2 horses that swam to a nearby island, perished in the disaster, and the wreck has never been found.
We may have mapped the seabed in a number of places. We're still nowhere. We've 100% mapped the moon and Mars and every near-Earth asteroid, and we are under 30% for the oceans. With that, even when we've mapped it, we don't have the same level of detail. In an older wreck like that, the bones may be so corroded and eroded and scattered that it's not obvious as to what it is. Or it's only obvious if somebody goes down, dives in, maybe digs. So to that end, we can't figure it all out. But ultimately, when somebody gets that stuck in their mind, let's go find it, then expeditions happen. Angel Gabriel is another one in Maine.
Right. The Angel Gabriel, 1635, sunk just off Pemaquid.
Not everything's been found. There's still plenty to do and to find and to explore and to discover. And as Clive Cussler used to say when I hosted his TV series for him back 20-odd years ago, he'd close every episode out by saying, "So now it's your turn to get up. Get off that couch. Go out into the mountains, the deserts, and the oceans and search for history."
The Sea Hunters, a terrific series.
For anybody out there that is an avid shipwreck explorer, go do it. And indeed, off of that coast, one of the last casualties of World War II was found not too long ago.
That's right. USS Eagle, originally classified by the Navy as a boiler explosion incident off the coast of Cape Elizabeth. Recently just reclassified by the Navy as a torpedo strike made by a German submarine.
Therein lies the other aspect. A lot of these wrecks, unless it's way out there, happen in somebody else's backyard. And so if it's in your backyard, go look for it.
Okay, all you would-be sea hunters, you now have your marching orders. Jim, I just have one last question. You know, the name of this podcast is Tales of the Sea. Let me ask you, is there a story, a book, or a song, maybe a memory, comes back to revisit you time and again? It brings you a special sense or connection with the sea.
It goes back to that very first shipwreck that I saw in the mud. The thought of all of these ships sailing in response to the news of the discovery of gold in California, bringing this fleet of several hundred ships from American ports, matched by several hundred more from Asia, from Australia, from South America, and from Europe, and converging on tiny little San Francisco Bay to crowd and pack that bay with hundreds of ships that are then set aside and laid up because all the crews have run off to the gold fields. That's one of the more magic aspects of it all for me, and it remains my touch point. And in fact, on this other screen on this computer is the manuscript for the next book, which writes about all of that, coming back to where I started those decades ago. And so with it, I think of that. I think of all of the tremendous history that surrounds the idea of the gold rush. And for me, it's that aspect of the maritime part of it all. And yes, there's a song, because as the sailors used to say, "Oh, there's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento." So yes, so blow you winds hi-ho, yes, so for California, there's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento. And you can see now why I never had a career in sailing.
Oh, no, there's plenty of time, Jim. Oh, thank you so much. This has been just wonderful. Thank you for sharing highlights of your career and your deeply felt passions.
I love writing. I like sharing what I do, whether it's on film, whether it's in books, podcasts. I've been lucky, and I'm able to see things that most people don't, and with that comes the responsibility to share it.
Well, we are the lucky ones. Thanks again, Jim.
My pleasure, Mark. Thank you for the invite. It's been great chatting with you.
That ends this episode of Tales of the Sea. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend or two. And a very special thanks to my guest today, James Delgado. Be sure to look for all of Jim's books, including The Great Museum of the Sea, A Human History of Shipwrecks, at your favorite bookstore or online retailer. This episode of Tales of the Sea was produced at Munjoy Studios in Portland, Maine. As always, special thanks to my producer, Jewel Selbo. And remember, you'll find this podcast, Tales of the Sea, wherever you stream your favorite podcast. I'm Mark Winkworth. Thanks for listening.